on section 2, we have Graeme Cook, who from IPPR, he's going to speak to us about the Condition of Britain reports. Graeme is a research director for IPPR who specialises in children, families, housing, jobs and skills welfare. He sets the strategic direction for IPPR's overall research programme, and he's going to present their findings in relation to national trends for employment, women returning to work, youth employment, impact of an older workforce, and the impact of welfare reform changes. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, many thanks for the invitation to speak this evening. So fantastic to see so many people here. I'm going to talk principally about unemployment, employment, and what can be done locally to try and boost the employment rate, get more people into work. I'm going to say something about the state of the labour market nationally, say something about some work that I was involved with at the organisation I work at, which was a book called The Condition of Britain, which was looking at some of the major social policy challenges facing the country, and in particular look at some of the ideas that we proposed around the future of employment support. And then finally mention some work I've been involved with in Islington, just to provide some examples of what local government can do and what local authorities, local places in general can do on this issue. And just by way of introduction, clearly this is another area where the national picture makes a massive difference. The state of the economy as a whole, the health, levels of growth in the economy is the major factor that affects the rate of job creation. Issues about the regulation of the labour market, so things like 0 hours contracts, insecure work, they are obviously matters that are national policy. And also, as came through in Alison's talk, it's clearly not the case that any job or a job on its own is going to be enough to lift people out of poverty or to tackle inequality. The quality of your job, your wages, the way you're treated in the workplace is obviously massively important too. However, having a job is better than not having a job. And one of the major ways in which people can improve their living standards is obviously to access employment. And also, where work is good, it obviously has lots of other benefits for people. It provides people with social networks, it gets people out of the house, it deals with people's mental health problems, and it gives people a sense of purpose and direction often in their life that they don't have if they spend a long period of time out of work. And therefore, whilst it's definitely not enough to say that just get people a job and that will solve the problem, it's much, much better if people do not spend long periods of time locked out of the labour market or locked out of the chance to benefit from work. So, on the state of the labour market as a whole, essentially my message here is that it's a sort of mixed picture. So on the one hand, we had a big recession after the financial crisis, a big rise in unemployment, big rise in long-term unemployment. But in the last year, 18 months, the headline rates of unemployment have improved considerably. So there's been a big 700,000 more people in employment, a big fall in unemployment overall, fall in long-term unemployment, more young people in work. So there has been the general return to growth in the economy has led to more people moving into work and fewer people being out of work. However, there remain some serious weaknesses in the labour market, some of which are very long-standing in the UK labour market and some of which are newer. And just to touch on a few of those. So first of all, as people I'm sure will have heard, every time you turn on the news, whilst many more people are in employment, there's been an unprecedented squeeze on wages, in particular wages in the bottom half of the labour market, so people in lower paid work that have faced basically, people haven't had a pay rise in 5 years, and so whilst more people are in employment, what they're bringing home in their pay packet hasn't gone up. There are a significant minority of people who face temporary or insecure work. We've heard a lot about, there's 1 million people on 0 hours contracts, more people in temporary work who would like a full-time or permanent position, a large group in self-employment, some of which reflect people starting their own business out of an active choice, but some people who are forced into self-employment because they can't find a permanent employment contract. A large number of people in jobs but who would like more hours, who are working part-time but would like to work full-time if it was possible for them to do so. And underneath all that, UK productivity, i.e. how much we all produce when we go to work, has basically been flat through the recession, which is basically the explanation for why we've seen a growth in employment but not a rise in wages. And so that is a good thing, the fact that more people are in work and that unemployment is coming down, but it's clearly the case that that's not enough to make sure that people are gaining from the effort that they're putting in, and that employment is leading to reduced levels of poverty. However, the impact of the downturn has been much more significant, has not been even, essentially. That if you have been in work throughout the recession, then actually your pay, the analysis has shown that your pay has gone up. The big problem has been for people who are moving in and out of employment, and particularly for people who continue to be locked out of the labour market. And so even though there's been an increase in employment overall, the number of people claiming, for instance, sickness and disability benefits, incapacity benefit, and the new employment support allowance hasn't gone down at all. So we've got 700,000 more people in work, but the number of people on those benefits, which is typically people who've been out of work for a longer period of time, people with a health condition or disability, that hasn't gone down at all. And so what we learn from that is that simply a rising economy, an improving economy, is not going to on its own enable those who face greater needs or barriers to employment being able to benefit from that. And that is where policy can make a big difference. So the economy as a whole matters, but targeted policies that help those who are unlikely to benefit from a rise in employment is really important too. And on that, that is one of the central issues that our work in this book, The Condition of Britain, was looking at. And we looked at what policies this government's put in place, and indeed previous governments, to try and address this problem. And essentially, whilst in this country, broadly speaking, we are fairly effective at helping people who lose their jobs back into employment relatively quickly. If they lose their job, most people, the vast majority of people, do find another job fairly quickly. There is a minority of people who spend a long period of time out of work, and the government's main policy to deal with that, something called the work programme, people will have heard about it, has been incredibly ineffective for people on sickness and disability benefits, where only 5% of people going through that programme have found work. Actually, only about 10% of people on those benefits participate in any form of employment support at all. The vast majority of them are not getting any help to find work. And that is a major problem if you want to address poverty, address inequality. And often those rates are very high in London boroughs like Hackney. Now that's partly about high-profile administrative and delivery problems. As Alison said, a massive increase in sanctions, which has been, very largely counterproductive, has pushed people away from help. There's been problems with the administration of employment and support allowance in particular, lots of problems with the work capability assessment in particular, which has been an unmitigated disaster. But it's also the case that there are sort of deeper reflections to take from those. Like, even if we got that system as currently designed working more effectively, it still is very unlikely to work for those people who will find it hard to find a job if they just make sure they've got an up-to-date CV and they're applying for lots of jobs. And some of those factors lead you to think that we need a different kind of approach to deal with that problem, where local authorities, local partners, local people come to the fore. So partly it's because the work programme is a national programme commissioned in central government to a private or voluntary provider who has no connections with other services that operate in the areas in which they are trying to help people. So no connection to the health service, social care, housing, which has obviously come up a lot already, substance abuse services. And if you want to help people get work who face a range of those problems, you need those services working together more effectively. And you can't do that in a nationally commissioned programme where all those services sit outside. They're often operating across very large geographies, across the whole of London. And it's very hard then to make those kind of services fit local conditions, the local labour market. It makes it hard to have really engage relationships with local employers, because often that's what's really crucial, is finding specific jobs that might work for a specific individual, but having a negotiation with the employer. As Alison said, can this job be done part-time? Can it be done with different sort of hours? Can there be particular support put in place to enable an individual to work? Can there be ongoing support once they move into a job? That's very hard to do in a nationally commissioned large-scale programme. There's also just not enough money in the programme. The amount of money that's provided to support each individual person, often about £1,500 or £2,000, just isn't enough. And where there is often some resource, money, capacity, people locally that could contribute to that effort, and yet they're locked out of the programme. And often they're using, these kinds of programmes, they're using very standardised ways of helping people. So making sure people have got a CV, making sure they're applying for jobs, which, you know, for lots of people is absolutely fine, but for people who face more complex barriers to work, who've spent longer out of work, that's just simply not going to be enough, and often is wasting their time. And just to give one personal example, outside my paid job, I volunteer with people who are long-term unemployed, and it's so frustrating because you see individuals. There's a guy that I've helped for a while who has spent 35 years in prison and has got mental health issues, not that wouldn't enable him to work at all, but that make life harder for him. And he is desperate to work, and he applies for loads of jobs. And all this programme really does is sort of make sure his CV's up to date and kind of sort of checks he's looked online for jobs and things. It's just, and this is someone who's got massive motivation to work, but the programme just isn't able to help him properly. And so in our work, we proposed a series of changes that we think should be made to this kind of area of policy that would make it more effective. And in particular, recognise that people with long-term or permanent health conditions or disabilities are going to need a different kind of support from people who've just lost their job, that would be much better done, organised, delivered, managed locally, whether that's at the local authority level or across a group of local authorities, across London or parts of London, where it would be possible to develop programmes that brought together the health service, GPs, housing providers, social care, to create much more intensive, personalised support for people, where you have caseworkers who work with people, coach people, build their self-confidence, help them to access opportunities to improve their chances of work, integrate their health treatment into with their back to work support, have specific relationships with local employers who they build rapport with, and they can engage to create job opportunities that are likely to work for people. And that's also more likely to bring more money in, because things like public health budgets then come into play, European money, European Social Fund money that can often be spent on these kinds of programmes. So it's possible to create a more effective service. And then if these services are effective, then some of the savings that would be generated from people no longer relying so heavily on social security benefits, some of that saving could be kept locally and reinvested in programmes to help more people into work. Now, some of that, on its own, that's not going to be enough, because you also need to have a plan for how you're going to create jobs, how you're going to invest in local economies, how you're going to invest in skills and apprenticeships. But alongside that, a programme of that kind, where we didn't have a centralised national government solution, but we said to local areas, where the problem is complex and needs a range of services to work together, local authorities or local partners are likely to be most effective, then that could make a big difference. Now, that is going to require a national policy change. So I think that is something that we've been arguing for, and I hope that others will support. But I also wanted just to finish by talking a little bit about some work that I've been involved with in Islington, which has tried to look at what would be possible to do short of that big national policy change. So I think that would be a good idea to do in the next Parliament. The current work programme contracts will come to an end in 2016. There'll then be a question about what comes after that. But there's also opportunities for local partners, local services, local people to make a difference. Now, in Islington, over the last, the local authority in Islington set up an employment commission at the start of this year that I've been a commissioner on. It's brought together all the kind of key players in the area, the council, Job Centre Plus, the health service, the local college, schools, local businesses, as well as the voluntary sector. And there's been a whole series of local events very similar to this, where we've talked to local people about what the particular challenges are there, and also what they've got to contribute, because often it's that loads of people have got time and their knowledge of the local area that they want to contribute to, and that local groups and individuals can make a big difference to. The report for that is going to be out on Wednesday, and it's got a number of recommendations to people and organisations in Islington that could make a difference. And just to briefly touch on some of the things that will be talking about. So for young people, clearly there's a big thing that local areas can do, which is improve the connections between local employers and local schools, because one of the big things that makes a difference for young people is whether they've had some experience of the workplace, whether they've stepped inside a workplace while they've been at school and had some exposure to that. Clearly, careers advice and guidance is a big thing that it's possible for schools and local areas to make a difference on. And then making sure that no young person falls through the gaps completely and becomes what is called in the jargon NEET, not in education, employment or training, where they're not in college, they've left school and they're not in employment. And that is a big problem for young people who spend a significant amount of time disengaged in that way. There's things that can be done with employers, so trying to help and encourage firms to hire local people and to go the extra mile in accepting. Often what good local authority schemes do is identify a specific job, then prepare local people for that job. So prepare pick the people who've got the kinds of skills that are likely to work for that job, help people get ready for an interview, work with the employer to make sure that job works for them, and then get commitments from local employers to hire local people, and use the kinds of recruitment agencies, rather than just going out to a standard recruitment agency, make a commitment to hire local people who need an opportunity. Try to make sure that what local colleges are providing, the courses local colleges are providing, are appropriate to the kinds of needs that local employers have, and make sure that we're training people to do jobs that exist in local areas. It's very hard to do that other than at a local level, because you don't have the relationships or the knowledge about the kinds of firms and their skill needs in the local area, and try and encourage employers to improve the quality of their work, pay the living wage, offer more flexible work and part-time work opportunities. And then for people who are on long-term, who've been on benefit for long periods of time or out of work for a long period of time, get those local partners working together much more effectively, so there is more like what feels like to people more like a single service, a single offer to people who are looking for work. And there's a number of specific things that can be done there. Getting GPs involved, getting GPs talking about employment, and when people present with a health problem, like getting them to talk about whether work is possible for them and what it would take for them to work. There are lots of proven health-led interventions that help people into employment that the health service locally could commission. There's a really good example in Westminster where they're using something called individual placement and support, a really well-evidenced intervention that helps people with mental health conditions into employment. Co-locate services, so get employment advisors to operate in libraries and in children's centres, in GP surgeries, rather than in job centres, which are often very unattractive or intimidating for people. Harness local volunteers. There's often with people, it is very not specialist technical knowledge that you need to help someone get into work, and often there's lots of local people who could be mobilised to contribute and try and make a difference. Specific jobs, broker work experience opportunities, link up with the college and make sure, as I say, that the courses they're providing are ones that will lead to real job opportunities in the local area. So I think there's clearly a huge amount that lies outside local control, whether it is the economy or whether it is national policies around benefits and sanctions and Job Centre Plus. But in addition, there's loads of resource, energy, commitment in local areas that if properly harnessed and mobilised, can make a big difference, especially for those people who are locked out of work for a long time, which is often bad for their living standards, means that they don't earn enough to make ends meet, but is also damaging to their social life and to their mental well-being as well. And so I think that's one issue that the Commission might want to look into further.
I think it's really reassuring to hear that what we're doing in Hackney is going down the right lines. So our Ways Into Work is doing a great deal of work with local businesses, trying to get young people into jobs. I know that our regeneration team is doing a lot of work with some of our tech companies as well, that there is plans for an opportunity hub in the south of the borough, working specifically with tech jobs and getting young people into tech jobs within what is a massively growing industry in our borough. You've talked about working with other businesses, not just tech businesses, and a piece of work that CSSI has recently done. We went out into the community and talked to some of our micro businesses, and they're already taking steps to ensure that they are providing training opportunities for young people, paid training opportunities for young people, particularly women in some non-traditional trades as well. So it's refreshing to hear what you're saying is that we're actually going down the right lines. There is, however, as you say, the state of the labour market does throw up a number of challenges around temporary work, self-employment, part-time work, zero-hour contracts, and these are all issues that have been we have been thinking about here in the council as well. And there are weaknesses in the government's programme, particularly around sanctions, and we've been reading a lot about sanctions and the implications for people's life and well-being when their benefits are sanctioned.
Oh, hello, I'm Liz Hughes. I work for Healthwatch Hackney now, but I previously worked for the Community Empowerment Network. And my question is that when there was the Community Empowerment Network, part of it was a network of small community-based organisations who helped local people into employment. And the network was also part of one of the local strategic partnerships and worked closely with the council and with a local college. And there was an apprenticeship scheme, and there were people helping people into work based in GP surgeries and in the community. And there were lots of community-specific services, and it seemed to be working quite well. When the work programme came along, that was just completely decimated. It disappeared. None of those small organisations could get contracts with the work programme providers. They tried, but the kind of rates they were being offered and the numbers of people were so extreme that none of them could do it. Most of those organisations, or a lot of those organisations, have either stopped doing that kind of work or just disappeared. So my question is, how can we stop that kind of thing happen? How can government listen to where things are actually working already? And how can we stop having to reinvent the wheel all the time?
I mean, you couldn't have given me a better example with your Community Empowerment Network of sort of my critique of the current policy, which is, as you say, we moved to very large-scale contracting that had such a high barrier to entry that unless you were an organisation of a very significant scale, and also crucially were able to take on a large level of financial risk, you know, you just couldn't deal with the work programme. It just wasn't possible. And that is a sort of, there's a philosophical point underneath it, actually, which is a belief in economies of scale as being always the sort of right approach. And what that lacks is an understanding of complexity, I suppose, and the need for non-standardised responses to very complicated social problems. And I suppose what I'm exactly arguing for is, particularly for people that are not, won't find work easily on their own, the argument for locally driven solutions that are able to harness exactly that kind of local energy, commitment, knowledge is exactly the way that we should be going. And so the pots of money would be smaller, and therefore it would be easier for smaller organisations to get involved. Not that there then becomes a sort of monopoly takeover by one organisation in a local area, but that you're able to knit together a whole range of different kind of local organisations in the voluntary sector, local authority, statutory services, and that kind of organisation can be part of the solution in a way that it's not possible in a big nationally contracted programme like the work programme. Well, no, I agree. I mean, why? I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. It's completely right. We need to stop doing big national contracting and allow that kind of thing to flourish. So we don't need to invent it again, as you say. We just need to create a policy framework and a funding arrangement that makes what works, like the thing you mentioned, happen. So I think it's about clearing away the thing that's stopping what you were arguing for from happening.
Hello. Yeah, my name is John Thornton and I'm a resident here in Hackney. And Graeme, I really want to thank you for a great presentation. And I don't want in any way to demean the fantastic work that you're doing in Islington. But as you're aware, there are many disabled people in this country who, since the last government, the Labour government, brought in ATOS and brought in sanctions, and this government has carried on making it even worse for disabled people. There are many disabled people who are unable to work, and thousands, literally thousands of them have died as a result, as that lady was making, the chair was saying, because of the sanctions that they have faced. And many of them have committed suicide, and many others have actually died while their appeals are going through. So I don't want in any way to demean the great work that you're doing, but don't you think it's also time that we had a long-term strategy to actually to deal with the many disabled and, that old-fashioned term, chronically sick people who are unable to work and for whom going into the workplace would be detrimental to their health, particularly a workplace where we're seeing things like 0 hours, abuse in the workplace and things like that. So anyway, that's my question. Hello. Yeah, my name is John Thornton and I'm a resident here in Hackney. And Graeme, I really want to thank you for a great presentation. And I don't want in any way to demean the fantastic work that you're doing in Islington. But as you're aware, there are many disabled people in this country who, since the last government, the Labour government, brought in ATOS and brought in sanctions, and this government has carried on making it even worse for disabled people. There are many disabled people who are unable to work, and thousands, literally thousands of them have died as a result, as that lady was making, the chair was saying, because of the sanctions that they have faced. And many of them have committed suicide, and many others have actually died while their appeals are going through. So I don't want in any way to demean the great work that you're doing, but don't you think it's also time that we had a long-term strategy to actually to deal with the many disabled and, that old-fashioned term, chronically sick people who are unable to work and for whom going into the workplace would be detrimental to their health, particularly a workplace where we're seeing things like 0 hours, abuse in the workplace and things like that. So anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, I completely take that point. I mean, the ATOS sanctions has just created a lot of fear and insecurity and has done the exact opposite of what that kind of system should do, which is to try and identify people's capacities and their barriers and identify if it's possible for them to work. I mean, there's 2 points really. One is just that the design of the test, the work capability assessment, is bad in the sense that it doesn't start from saying, it starts with a binary question, which is, can someone work or can they not work, rather than a question which is, what kinds of work might this person be able to do, and what would it take to enable them to do it? Now, it might still be that the answer to those questions is, what kind of work can they do? None. And what would it take to enable it? It would be too difficult to achieve that. But I think that kind of framework would, be more sort of positive and empowering for people, and would be more likely to help those who can work to move into employment. And I suppose my aim would just be for as many people as possible to have that opportunity to work if that's what they want to do, while recognising clearly there are going to be some people for whom that isn't possible, and for those people we need to make sure that the social security system is there to support those people.
I've been a resident in Hackney for 15 years and I've got a small business here. My question is kind of a general question, which is that one of my observations is, since moving here, is that, and I think it's a London-wide problem as well, is the galloping rate at which the communities that we're living in are changing due to all the reasons that we are outlining here today, significantly housing and so forth, and the growing inequality. And in my own community, I've observed when we first moved in, the local retail outlets there weren't that many, but when you walked into the local shops and bought things, you met you met more people from a working class and immigrant community in those shops. What has happened significantly, and I'm part of it as well to an extent, is that when you walk into the local shops in our area now, you see very few people from any other community other than the local middle class community, which has grown. I don't think the working class community has shrunk, it's just become more invisible within the community and within the jobs on the street which are available.
Do you mean people more middle class in the working in retail?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. Within the small businesses within that community now. And I don't think it's just in my community in Hackney. I have friends who live in Stoke Newington who've made the same observation. So I guess all I'm doing is saying, how do you address that sort of out of control change which has happened in terms of the people who are sort of rising to the fore and taking the opportunities that are available, but at the same time, in doing that, are kind of unwittingly perhaps, actually I don't think it's unwitting, but are shutting out people who are still in existence there.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the answer is to your question. I mean, I think, I suppose it comes back to the point that you know, the labour market is very complicated and it's subject to lots of different kind of forces outside the control of the council or the national government. But what you can do is try to, A, make sure that individuals who are excluded from the labour market have the kinds of support, investments that will give them the best chance to compete against other candidates for jobs, and then to try and build relationships with local employers to try and make the argument for why they should give opportunities to people who they might otherwise overlook. And so often a business, they've got two sort of options. One is just a sort of easy recruitment kind of option, which is just sort of go to a local recruitment agency and take their candidates. Another would be to engage with the kind of schemes that obviously sounds like are going on in Hackney and in other local authorities, where they say, okay, yeah, we want to give, you know, appropriate candidates who face more disadvantages in their lives a chance. And some employers will go for that and some won't, but that, I suppose that's the kind of the best argument. Help the individual to have the opportunities and then work with the employers to try and get them to give those people a chance.
Yeah, I suppose I promised myself that tonight I wouldn't go, oh, we're doing that already, or, oh, that's, you know, but I feel I'm bursting with that actually, and Carol's picked up on some of that, and from your presentation as well, around employment. I think we may not have communicated it as one, everyone in the room may not know about it, but as Carol said, the Ways Into the Work scheme has done exactly what you describe and has been doing that since the Olympics. It was set up as part of trying to get local people into jobs, and it has been incredibly successful at getting mostly young people. I think it's over 4,000 people already into jobs, and making sure that those not just that we attract employers in, but we attract them employers in and businesses in and say to them, we want you to employ local people. We will make sure that local people and local young people have those skills, and we have those conversations, strategic conversations with the community colleges and with sixth form colleges to make sure that when, whatever your views are, when major hotels open up in the borough, we have a stream of young people available who have the right skills, and we set that in train quite early on to make sure that those skills are there. We've also looked at very much about apprenticeships. We, ourselves and partners, we supplied over 600 apprenticeships since 2010. That is quite a substantial achievement. And just last week, the Mayor launched Hackney 100, which has now, it's much more than 100, it's probably Hackney 200. And what that means is 200, a lot of local businesses signing up and saying, not only will we give young people work experience to help them with the skills and the understanding of what the employment means and what jobs means, but we're going to pay them, and we're going to pay them the living wage, and those jobs and that work experience will further down the line make a huge difference to those young people's ability to get into work. What I do think we do need to do, and actually we had a long meeting this morning to discuss it, is how effective are we at getting people who are long-term unemployed back into the labour market and back into jobs, especially women, especially the disabled, and how do we make sure that where they can work, they do work, they are able to work, but if they are unable to work, that we support them effectively. And that, I think, we probably we do have a piece of work to do, and we need to understand the challenges around that. I just pick up on the point about working class communities and the high street and jobs and businesses. I spent 2 hours on Saturday at a stall at Kingsland in Dalston about International Women's Day for the elimination of violence. And certainly from standing at this street stall in Dalston and looking at the people coming to shop and the businesses around there, it didn't feel like those communities were totally being pushed out. They're very much there. And I do understand in certain parts of the borough, it does feel that businesses are not reflective of the diversity, but in other parts they are. And sometimes we just don't have the levers to actually make those changes because we don't have the ability to say who can open a business and who can't, because that's, you know, it's about where we have power and where we don't. But I think I've heard this, I hear that feeling that diversity is being pushed out, but I certainly, you know, 2 hours in Dalston on Saturday, I didn't feel that myself.
You mentioned Dalston. It's not a reflection of, because many people come from somewhere else to come to Dalston. But if you look at Chatsworth Road and Stoke Newington, what the lady said is right, because diversity is being pushed out. And I've lived here for 40 years, and the transformation is incredible. People feel alienated. They feel as if they are in another country. So what you're saying is not a reflection the way I see it. And I hope you take that on board.
Thank you very much. I think we do. I think we certainly do take that on board. I think one of the things that we all hear as local councillors is about the rapid pace of change. I've been a councillor since 2002. Since 2002, the local community that I represent has been telling me about the rapid pace of change, and it is becoming more and more rapid. I think what Councillor Linden was saying is that there are pockets of change, and there is some stability as well. But she also said that there isn't an awful lot that we can do in terms of the market. We cannot dictate who can and can't open businesses in Hackney. But this is, we do not own all private properties, and we cannot decide who rents a private property and who opens a business there. What we can do, and what we have done, as Councillor Linden said in her introduction, is that we've had a community strategy dating back to, was it 2005? And so what we did very early on, when Jules Pipe became Mayor of Hackney Council, was to say, what do we want this borough to look like? And we have continuously been working toward that since 2005. And tonight is another opportunity for us to come to our community and say, what is it we want for our borough, and to work towards that.
Hi, my name is Laurie Elks. I've lived in Hackney since 1972. You didn't mention in your presentation at all the supply of affordable business premises. I have some reservations personally about the fact that the guy who used to mend my car has been displaced from a railway arch as part of a scheme to create a fashion hub in Hackney Central. My question to you is, do local authorities have the powers they need to create affordable business premises? And in boroughs like Hackney and Islington, where there are very strong competing land use pressures, particularly the pressure for residential, how councils should use the powers they have?
I confess I don't know enough about affordable business premises. I mean, obviously, the local authority is the planning authority, and so it has some decisions about how to designate land, residential or business. But I mean, I might ask Carol or Sophie to answer that question, because I mean, I just don't have the expertise on that.
I wanted to ask a question around people over 50 and getting people over 50 into work, particularly once they've been long-term employed. There are particular challenges to people once they hit 50 and unemployed, and how can we ensure that we're getting over 50s into work without competing against young people who also need to get into work.
I mean, on over 50s, to be honest, I'm not sure is that helpful a category. I don't know that the needs of over 50s are that different from the needs of someone who's 48, and so I'm not completely sure. I mean, I think there's an issue for people who have worked industry for a long period of time and then they no longer work in it because there's been some change in the industrial structure or whatever, and then there's clearly a role for your training and college provision to make sure there's a chance to move into a different sort of line of work. And there's clearly some issues with new technology, although I'm not 50 and I already feel like I need to learn about new technology. So I think there's those issues. But other than that, the main, I would say they're sort of similar to other people who are long-term unemployed, which is, work experience and good job matching and addressing any kind of health condition that might stop them working. I know that's a slight cop-out, but I'm not sure of the argument for a sort of specific approach for people who are over 50.